Hey, Science 10 class, it's Mr. Lum. Hopefully you watched the introduction on Gregor Mendel and some of the things that he studied. We're going to talk a little bit about him and then talk about his experiment that he did. So, so first off, as you saw, Gregor Mendel is really the first guy who studied genetics, even before genetics was a word, before we knew what a gene was. It was before the discovery of DNA. It makes his discoveries and how he understood things pretty impressive, considering that we didn't even know what a gene was. We didn't know what an allele was, which is a variation of a gene. Yeah. Anyways, you saw who he was. He was a religious man who did work on genetic studies. And he did most of his research on pea plants. And that was good because pea plants were an easy thing to study. And we'll talk a little bit about why was it easy. So first off, Mendel chose pea plants for a lot of reasons. There were a lot of different phenotypes. And if we remember what phenotypes means, a phenotype means the observable characteristic of a plant or of an organism. So, so for example, these are examples of phenotypes. The flower color, the stem length, so how big it is, the bean color. We talked about phenotypes as well. It is the thing that you can observe. It is not always the thing that you can like visually see. So blood type, having A blood or AB blood or O blood, that's also a phenotype, even though you can't see it. So it is just like how genes are expressed is the phenotype. Genotype is the genetics behind it. Now, so one, there was a lot of different phenotypes that he could observe for pea plants. And we'll talk again about this later, is that the genes for those were very, very simple in nature. So it made things a lot less complex. Human beings have a lot more complex genetics, so it'd be difficult to study humans. The next reason why he chose pea plants is that he could breed pea plants very easily. He could breed a couple of generations in just one summer. That was doable. And that made him allowed him to look at how those genetics were passed down without waiting for like a whole year or several years. He could just look at just in one summer a couple of generations. And that's the third thing right there, is that he could do many generations of pea plants very quickly. If he studied something like tortoises or humans, it would take many years for him to look at just 2 or 3 generations. Now, we're going to just focus on one characteristic of what Mendel looked at, and he looked at flower color. So Mendel took a pea plant that made purple flowers, and he looked at how, and they also made white flowers, and he bred them together. So he took like a purple flower plant and he bred it with a white flower plant. And what he found was that all of the kids, all of the offspring were purple flowered, 100%. And he didn't just do it once, he did it like hundreds and hundreds of times, maybe even upwards of 1,000 times. And he took like 1,000 of these, what he called true breeding purple plants, these ones right here, and he bred them with true breeding white plants. And so he bred these two together and they only made this purple plant right here. He then did something interesting with this. He bred these ones right here with each other. And what happened is when he took 2 of these ones and he bred them together, he found that the next generation had 75% purple and 25% were white. So what he found was that this white gene, or that white phenotype, skipped a generation. It didn't go to the next generation, it went to the generation after. And he wanted to figure out, like, why did it do that? And so this is just another picture. Again, he took a true breeding purple, a true breeding white, bred them together, and he found that they were all 100% purple. He did this like almost 1,000 times. He took all of these purple plants, he started interbreeding them, or breeding them with each other. And what he found was, again, he got approximately 75% were purple, and then about 25% were white. And he found that this white gene skipped the generation. And he was like, how does that work? How did that white gene or that white trait skip a generation? So that's what he found. Again, that 75 to 25 split for that purple and white. Now, and he couldn't quite figure out why it was that 75 to 25. But what he did notice was that when he did that with everything else, with short and long stem, he got the same ratio, that 75 to 25. When he looked at bean color, yellow to green, he got that same ratio, 75 to 25. So he knew it wasn't just like luck of the draw here. He's breeding thousands and thousands of plants, and he's always consistently getting a 75% to 25% ratio. And he's like, well, how am I getting that 75 to 25 ratio here? And so he needed to try to solve this mathematically. And so Gregor Mendel made some assumptions about how these traits were passed on. And I want to just like remember what makes it so impressive is that he did this before DNA was discovered. He did this before mitosis and meiosis were really known about. And like they didn't fully understand how mitosis fully worked. They didn't know about genes or any of that kind of thing. So what he kind of said is that an organism has 2 genes for every trait. I do want to emphasize and kind of reiterate that he didn't use the word genes. He used the word elements, but now we can say genes because we know what they are. Because genes wasn't a word back then. So he said an organism has 2 elements, or we can now say an organism has 2 genes for every trait. They get 1 gene from their mom and 1 gene from their dad. So for example, you have 2 genes for your hair color. You might only have 1 hair color, but those genes might say something different. And so that'd be your genotype, and your hair color is your phenotype. Now, the law of segregation says that alleles, or in other words, let's remember that allele means a variation of a gene. So it states that genes, or alleles, for each inherited trait, I don't know why I wrote that twice, for each inherited trait separate during gamete formation. And remember, if we remember the word gamete from last time, a gamete means sperm or egg. So it states that an allele for each inherited trait separate during gamete formation. And when gamete formation occurs through meiosis, each gamete gets 1 allele. Okay, so we'll talk about, like, say if here is a person's dad. Okay, they have 2 genes. Okay, so here is 1 gene, and here is another gene. And they got those two genes from their the grandfather and grandmother, so grandparents. And they had, this grandparent donated this one gene, and this grandparent donated, we'll do it in a different color, this blue gene right here, and we'll change this one to blue, okay? And so, and then when this dad is going to have kids, maybe one of those kids, say this person has 2 kids, maybe one of those kids will get this gene, and then the other kid might get this gene right here. And if he had a third kid, it might also get like that blue gene right there. And so that blue gene might come from this grandparent right there. Okay. And they have 2 genes. They only get to pass on one of those genes to their kid, and then the mom passes on the other half of all those genes. That is what we call the law of segregation. And he said sometimes you don't get to see certain genes, and we call those ones recessive. And we call the ones that you can see, we call those ones dominant. So this is when one trait can dominate over another trait, and this is because one allele or one gene is dominant over another allele. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to give symbols to these alleles or genes. We're going to give, if it's dominant, we're going to give it a capital letter, and if it's recessive, we're going to give it a small letter. So for this particular case, we said Mendel found that purple was dominant. That's why we saw purple more often. We saw it at a 75% ratio to a 25% ratio, because purple is dominant. So we're going to give it a capital P for purple. Okay. Now the white is recessive. Okay. Now we're going to give it a little p because it's recessive. Okay. We use the same letters even though we don't say that it's W, because the capital letter is P for purple, and we're not going to give a W for white. It's just not purple. It's white. So we're going to give it a small letter.